Eliza and Lori, to talking to you both about archives. I think what we were talking about earlier just really gave me chills. So I'm excited to dive in with you. Eliza, so you're an assistant professor at Yale, African American Studies and English. And when we were chatting, I know at the top I mentioned that you were very clear that you're a literary scholar. And so I'm curious if you can explain your point of view on archives as a literary scholar, and maybe even a work that you'd point your students to that exemplifies the use of archives in storytelling.
Yeah, sure. And I'll just say I was very clear about that because, I'm not a historian, and I think that historians have a very specific, different sort of about lives, and think that historians are kind of the front line, if you will, of kind of archival work. So yes, I'm trained in English, literary studies. And I really think that impacts kind of how I view archives. In my work, I use archives not only as research to sort of learn more about writers and the works I write about, but I also look at how creative writers and artists utilize and engage with archives in their attempts to write about, imagine, and reimagine Black history. And I do this with a class called Narratives, Contemporary Black Historical Fictions. And it's inspired by John Keane's 2015 book of stories and novellas, which is called Counter Narratives as well. And the idea behind the class is that, novelists, playwrights, poets, and visual artists have long offered us these kind of counter narratives or counter histories, right? A way into the past that involves a constellation of research, imagination, and a determination to sort of challenge the very ways that we think of and write history, right? Capital H history. So in class, we focus on experimental sort of contemporary texts that don't just use the content of Black history, but also sort of the form, right, and the structure. And they pay attention to things like literary form and in order to communicate a sort of theoretical or political orientation toward Black history. And I would say that the class is interested in both the possibilities and the limits of these projects, right? Of these sort of attempts to use creative production to repair or restore or expand, right? Or reject, right? Certain aspects of the Black past. Some examples of work that we read works like Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is inspired by the life of Margaret Garner, M. Norbisi Phillips' Zong, which rearranges the text of the court case from the Zong massacre into a book-length poem. That's a major text for us. We read poems and stories that reimagine the lives of Phyllis Wheatley, Sally Hemings, Sarah Bartman, Bob Cole, the composer, Langston Hughes, among others. And let's see what else. We also look at artwork a lot. So we look at paintings that use archival documents, like work by Titus Kaphar and Firelight Baez and lots of other things. So I would say the archives we look at in class, are not exactly personal archives, but they're archives that are very personal to both these Black writers and artists, and also to Black readers, I would say. So we try and sit with kind of what that means for the personal, the emotional, the sacred to be tied up in these official or state archives. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's really. I want to take the class. I'm curious about. I think of Saidiya Hartman, obviously this writer with Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments that sort of is able to take archives and sort of tell maybe a different story than by weaving them together. Sure, some of it is fiction, but weave together a different viewpoint on Black life. And I'm curious about your stance on that. How when it comes to writing and retelling our histories, is there a confrontation or a tension in creators sort of telling a history that we haven't been told, and maybe even telling a truer history by way of doing so? Does that make sense? Like, how do we
think so.
So much, yes, so much of it is from the white male gaze. So much is missing. It takes people typically of that culture from those communities to take those archives and better tell the story that we weren't told.
Yeah, so I mean, scholars do this work too, right? Not just creative writers and artists. And I think Saidiya Hartman's work is probably the most well-known kind of recent example of how disciplinary conventions can be creatively reworked or retooled to respond to what existing archives conceal or efface, right? And so she has theorized, for people who don't know, she has theorized critical fabulation, which is sort of a methodological response to this impossibility, really, of recovering or reconstituting or repairing the lives and experiences of the enslaved. And so she describes critical fabulation as, and I have it actually right here, as a quote, straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time, enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of the captives precisely through the process of narration, end quote. And she also says that her sort of approach is that by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, I've attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, which I think that's really interesting language, to displace the received or authorized account and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done, end quote. So I think critical fabulation is a wonderful example of how scholars also engage with and are inspired by creative writers and artists. And I would say that, while not replacing archives, right, there is a way that this kind of work, I think, deeply supplements these archives and expands them and helps us think about, what do we do, right? What do we do with the archives of slavery that are traumatic, right? And that are kind of deform and derange the histories that we're fighting against, right? That these counter narratives and counter histories are attempting to intervene within. So I think her work is a great model for that kind of possibility.
And the word jeopardize, you're right, is just like, wow, powerful use of
Yeah.
language to underscore what she's doing. How do you talk to your students about employing their own archives in telling their stories, if at all?
Yeah, so I do encourage them to, think about their own lives, their own families. I see so much of the work that I do as teaching students to engage critically with the world, right? So not just with texts and with novels, but with the world around them. So I think that sometimes that asks of them to kind of make art out of sort of what they already have and what exists and what might be an archive that seemed to not be before, that seemed to be an everyday object or just sort of the matter of everyday life. So I definitely encourage them to do that. My students always do some sort of project, usually at the end of the class, where I ask them to create their own kind of counter narratives, and usually based on some of the archival material that they viewed in class. But almost always, most of the students will in some way bring in their own personal history, their own family history. They'll do, we had some wonderful projects last semester where people used audio recording of their grandmother talking, right? Or they wrote these sort of short stories, or they used family photos, family photo albums. So honestly, I think when you are talking about archives, even if they are official archives, people always gravitate to their personal archives, right? And that's always sort of the thing that helps them to understand how historical narrative is produced and is contested and expanded, I think.
Mhm. I want to move on just briefly to Lori and weave you both together. But part of what we've been talking about is who gets to tell our histories, right? And sort of what are the counter narratives to those histories that we have been told? Of course, for Indigenous folks, so much of their histories are oftentimes locked up in places that they don't have access to, or they don't own their own histories tangibly in that sense. And so, Lori, I'm just curious. For Indigenous folks, so much of the culture lives within the people, and it's not necessarily in the media. How do you make an active case for reimagining, reviving, creating, or creating tangible archives that might not be there?
Well, I think, one of the examples I'd like to use is Bud Lane from the Siletz tribe in the Northwest Coast. And I could hear his voice telling me the story of the weaver is one of his relatives who wove through three wars. And it was also a period of time for them when their tribe was terminated as a tribe, and mostly due because of the wealth of their natural resources. And so, one morning you wake up and you're no longer, have your treaty rights, with the United States. And so that community, alone has fought long and hard to not only regain their termination from, I think it was 1954, to then when they regained their federal recognition, I think it was about 1978. And, their commitment was to really, I think the word you used earlier was repair and restore, reminded me of a story of when they brought some cultural items home from the National Museum of the American Indian. And they were excited to dance the regalia that was brought home. And they had, laid down the weaving that the men wear on the table, and they laid it right next to the weaving that came from the National Museum of the American Indian. And, I think the conversation we had prior to this was just about, before this Zoom, is spirit moves, and our relatives are in a lot of the cultural items that are in the National Museums of the American Indians and the Smithsonian and all over. And so when they brought this home, it was important for them to dance the regalia because it's made to dance, because it has spirit, it has life, and be a part of that ceremony and to hear those songs and to hear the language. So they could feel the energy of the new weaving next to the one that came home. And then they saw some damage on the weaving and they said, we need to repair that. Bud Lane and his family and folks in the community said, you're good, because they borrowed it to then send it back. And the anthropologists, I guess they would call them, who came out were really nervous, like, you can't, no, you like, you can't do that. And they said, well, we're going to repair them anyway. And, because they need it to look beautiful again. And, and then they sent it back. But it ended up being a story in the Smithsonian magazine that Bud said they wrote about later. He's the vice chair of his tribe today and the language speaker. And, that they end up writing about that, of how are we shifting this way of, white, larger institutions' practices, that we're then expected to follow. And I was on the one of the websites for the National Park Service too, and it reminded me of when the Cheyennes brought back, repatriated home to their communities, some, human remains. And there's a picture on the National Park Service website, and it's just probably about 17 or 18 men walking, and they're all walking with these brown boxes. And they're bringing, their relatives home to rebury them. I'm so emotional today. But that was a lot to just bring family home, And I think the story of Bud there too is that, you continue to, the weavers believe so much that spirit moves through everything, and that you have to care for those cultural items, and you have to share them, and you have to dance them, and you have to sing them, because they believe you come into the world with the basket and you leave the world with the basket. And that's literally how it happens culturally in many weavers communities.
And you were speaking earlier about or with me anyway, about the archives in sort of these national establishments, and them, and a couple cases in which um, them being mislabeled. So I'm curious about how an indigenous community is able to, full on oral tradition, pass down, the history of their people, coming up against an institution that, fact is fact to them. How do you challenge an institution with oral history, particularly if they're looking to categorize based on what they see, particularly as fact, with archival?
I think the example I might have used was there's so many, from my tribe in particular, is there's so many crazy horse, sitting bull, and red cloud, headdresses out there that are claimed, to be of one particular person, and there's many of them, because the folks who stole the items, you know, would mislabel them, and then they would get into the museums as, or misidentify them or want to identify them like that. Um, so I think that's been going on so long. It's for so many years in our communities, but there's so many Native scholars out there now in these institutions that are correcting that, and then again, as I keep saying, NAGPRA, the Native Graves and Native American Graves and Protection Act that, was passed in the 70s, and Native American Rights Fund and Walter Echohawk and many worked on that. And that was, a law that was passed to bring those home. And most recently, we brought back some music from the Library of Congress with support of the National Endowment for the Arts. And it reminded me of my grandpa, how he used to sit in his old boot shop with all the old guys, and they would just be listening to those big, thick records of old songs, in Lakota. And we brought back a wax cylinder with the help of the National Endowment for the Arts, and bring that into all the, there's Native American, or the tribes now have their own tribal colleges, and ours was started in the 70s. And so our library at home now has a lot of our history, being brought home. But many of us don't have the storage facilities, the museums in our communities. So we rely on, doing the research and sending not only our culture bearers, but alongside alongside the scholars in those museums to properly identify. And we also have weavers that would prefer that some of their mothers and grandmothers' baskets might remain in a museum because they don't have a place for them at home. I think about Dolores Churchill in Alaska. She has her mother's weavings and her weavings in storage in a museum. I think it's on the Canadian side, but so that people could see them, come back and see them, and do the research, to learn those ways.
There's something, I mean, and the point of this panel, is really to talk about questioning archives. And I think it's really powerful, the movement that Indigenous people have fronted, to question, and to challenge, and fight for truth telling, in their artifacts, that are held up, and that we should always be questioning. Archives, particularly stories that have been woven from archives, and by who. Before we jump into questions, I really briefly want to talk about Archival Futures. And this is, to everybody. With the ubiquity of smartphones, everybody has the ability to create archival photos and videos at a moment's notice. One right now. But it's also all digital and less tangible, right? It's all bytes and megabytes, and it's on your phone. Sometimes you lose it if it's in the cloud. How does that affect the future of not only archive making, but of history telling? The ability for us to constantly be capturing video, photos, media in a way that we have not had the capacity to do before. Does it excite you? Does it make you nervous? And let's start with Bing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it feels like uh, it feels like it's going to give future generations the ability to tell stories about the past in much more clear ways. But I also wonder about what that means for the archival that's being created now in terms of its relationship to truth, or at least our perception of truth. Um,
Mm,
I think there's something to be said about what was being archived in the last, few hundred years, image-wise, and how, it's there's just a different relationship with truth. And I think a lot of that has to do with just generally, just as a society, like our relationship to cameras. I think people are a lot more media literate. They're a lot more fluent in what it means to be filmed and to be video and photographed. Um, and so I think that's the sort of thing that I'm curious about is
mm,
like what can be useful in terms of just getting at the truth moving forward.
mm. That's a really, really great perspective, and very true. That almost like over subjectivity of taking what maybe we assume was maybe more objective back in the day. Stanley, does this excite you? This sort of move to everybody having cameras and access to creating an archive? I think you're muted, Stanley.
Yeah, I think it does in a way. In a way, it doesn't because although people are filming everything with their cameras, a lot of it's really not archived. It's not collected anywhere. I think so much things are erased. And so I'm not sure. How much archive will last and be preserved and be accessible from people using their own cameras. I think the other thing that we really haven't talked about is just the access to kind of what we talk about as traditional archives. Is getting more and more restricted. It's all it's a business so many times. And the rights to footage, or our history, everybody's history in this country, is very expensive and being consolidated under a couple of gatekeepers. And so that's another thing that we really haven't talked about, and that's just kind of what's happening. You know, when I started making films, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, there were a bunch of not only ABC, NBC, and others, but there were kind of mom and pop places, that of people who were had collected some kind of archive, and they knew their archive really well, and it was kind of a personal mission to their archives. Those things don't exist. They've all been bought up by kind of the big conglomerates that are realizing that owning media of any kind is something that you can capitalize on, and so
Mm.
I'm very worried about that.
That's a really interesting point. I know there's a question about fair use that we'll get to just in a second. But before we get to the questions, just Lori, most particularly, uh, I'm curious about how technology plays into modern archive making among your community, and maybe how you support that at the First Peoples Fund. Just because, as we mentioned, with oral histories being so valued. How is your community sort of taking control of their modern lives via technology? How are you supporting that?
First Peoples Fund a while back received an award from the Bush Foundation and out of the Twin Cities, and we were able to purchase this rolling res arts bus, we call it, and it's a bus on wheels that goes all across Pine Ridge, and Pine Ridge is about the size of Connecticut, and there's 9 districts on there. And so, we quickly purchased Mac computers and cameras. And, Ryan Parker, who works at First Peoples Fund and runs the Rolling Res Arts Bus, is also a filmmaker who came from the Institute of American Indian Arts. And so he does film classes, on the res now, and it really stemmed from, our partnership with the Sundance Institute and, them coming out to share some of their films on the Rolling Res Arts Bus and, wanting the young people to really be able to tell their own stories. But I think also it helps around learning the language, young folks are interviewing their, just in the house with their iPhones, their grandparents and creating their own storyboards about, language in their family. And there's such a movement of young people 30 and under that, are learning the language. And just since we've been in the pandemic, we've been doing the stories I mentioned early on. We're able to do storytelling now through Zoom with our medicine people, our healers, our medicine men, and we get to learn about Lakota Star knowledge and our creation stories. And, every single, Sundancer family member, everybody jumps in when we hear, somebody's hosting a Zoom. And so I think that way of telling stories in our own platforms like this with each other. And then, I'm in my 4th year now of my Lakota language class, just since, Zoom, we just hunker down and we do class every day, and our teachers are, my teacher's Dennis Banks's granddaughter, and she's 25 years old, so I think it has the opportunity to create movements to tell our own stories and through our own narratives. Because I think about Wounded Knee, back in the 70s, it was a narrative that was being told by outsiders. And then when Standing Rock came, they did a lot of blockage. It was, they had a Wi-Fi hill. I can't remember what they called it, but that was the only access for people to be able to get on and through their iPhones. Dallas and others, stood on there and then those things that fly around, whatever they're called, they were able to zoom in and see what was happening on Standing Rock live. And so it created a whole movement again, whereas in Wounded Knee, when I was 10 years old, we just knew what was going on in our own community, and what we saw on the news was much different, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the power of video and Standing Rock alone. I mean, what that was able to do, to be able to capture that and to have that now archived, to tell that story over and over and over again, I think is really important. And also what you mentioned about this idea of young people interviewing their grandparents. What an amazing, addition to the texture and fabric of Indigenous life. I want to move to questions because we don't have so much time left, and I know that there have been lots of questions in the chat. So let me start here. A question from Stanley from Iensco. When the Oak Bluff residents communicated that they thought you were making a film about them, did you offer them anything from their archives that you had digitized? An installation, an exhibit, a personal copy? So maybe this is a question around how to, I guess, thank contributors to the making of your film.
Yeah, I mean, we gave people back digitized versions of the material that they gave us, and I mean that's like something that we kind of do, a standard thing that we do, and that that we promise people, and it helps kind of for them to release their archives. That we'll digitize it. For a place of our own. Those clips that you saw were very highly colorized in this beautiful way, and we give them a file of those things. But I think that I didn't mean to for people to misinterpret what I'm saying. But the film changed so much along the way, and that it moved from being a film about Martha's Vineyard as a community to being a film about Martha's Vineyard as a community, but also my family and my family's history.
You were mentioning earlier, Stanley, about this idea of or this fact of archives being bought up by a few gatekeepers and with a high price tag to a history that, in a lot of ways, probably should be free, should be able to access pretty freely. And so that brings up maybe the question of fair use for the filmmakers out there. And Rick asks, can the panelists discuss fair use? I think it's more of maybe a filmmaker question, but do you fight for that hard? And does it ever work in your favor? Ever work in your favor when going through legal to try and pull fair use clips that maybe, you're not charged for?
Yeah, I'll talk about that, and Bing can add on if he wants to. The first thing that people have to understand that fair use is a concept. It's not a law. It's not something that is you know um, black or white. So that you can claim fair use. I can claim fair use, and people can sue me. And so that fair use is not a be all and end all. I think that the other piece of fair use is when you're getting footage from let's say ABC, CBS, NBC. It's just how do you get the clean footage, right? Without their permission. So they're going to send you footage that's watermarked, and so to get the clean footage, you got to pay them for the footage. So you can't use fair use. Also, it's not your appetite for fair use. It's your broadcaster or wherever you're going to show the film. Like what is their appetite for fair use? Can you say to them, "Oh, I fair use the film," and they can say to you, "No, we don't believe in fair use, or we don't believe in fair use in that case." We ran into that in Miles Davis, which got a international distribution. And some places, like I believe England and other places in Europe, they don't have fair use, so you can't claim fair use for footage. So fair. More and more people are accepting fair use. I think partially because so much stuff is on YouTube, that it's hard. It's a little bit easier, and more people are accepting it. But it's you have to be really careful with fair use and
And
make
before we
sure
jump to
that.
Bing on that, oh, sorry. Before we jump to Bing on your thoughts, is just contextualize fair use for maybe folks who don't know what that is. Fair use is sort of a legal term that is used if we use, for example, if Stanley puts photos of Attica prisoners from long ago, can he get away with just showing them without paying for those actual photos because he's talking about them in the film? It is fact. Can you get away with sort of showing imagery in archival based on what your story is about without actually having to pay for it? Bing, what are your thoughts on the fair use question? Is it ever?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to honor the people who fought for it. It's only around because documentary filmmakers in the 90s, I believe, got together and advocated for this, along with some entertainment lawyers. But so yeah, it's your first point of contact when you're trying to claim fair use is typically going to be a lawyer who's going to watch your film and kind of sign off and everything. And different lawyers are going to have different opinions. So to Stanley's point, so a lot of it is down to different interpretations and subjectivities, and it does not prevent you from getting sued. It just it's a concept that's a major deterrent from people bringing lawsuits to you, though. Yeah, I mean, the one point of contention that we had with Minding the Gap was I pulled a YouTube clip that was able to allow me to tell the story of Zach's father's skate park. And, I think we went back and forth with me, the producers, and the lawyer about, whether we should try contacting the owner of the footage who posted it on YouTube, and we ended up not doing that. So it's your first point of contact is to make these conversations with your creative collaborators and your lawyer when you set out to claim this stuff.
Thank you. And Eliza, there's a question here. Lots of people in the chat apparently are very excited about this counter narratives class, which I am. So they're wondering, I think you had mentioned a few of these, but if you can briefly mention 3 or 4 books that are on the syllabus for your counter narratives course. Does it include fiction and nonfiction? How do you see fiction as archival materials? And can folks audit this course?
Thank you. It's great to hear how excited people are about the course. You actually can audit the class. I looked this up because I get this question a lot. So that's a Yale University issue that they need to work out. But I can say, let's see, some of the text. So it changes depending on, sometimes I teach the course to first years, so I do different kind of things depending on who I'm teaching the course to. But let's see, this semester, we start kind of with the Middle Passage, and we read Amiri Baraka's play, Slave Ship. We read poems by Robert Hayden. We read Lucille Clifton poetry. We read a lot. We read a lot of poetry. We read usually a few novels. So we've read Beloved in the past. We've read The Known World by Edward P. Jones. This semester we're going to be reading jazz. So we're going to end with Toni Morrison's novel Jazz, and spend a little bit more time sort of in the early 20th century. Which, at this point is 100 years ago. So it really is kind of historical, that period. And we read lots of poetry by Kiki Petrosino, Natasha Trethewey. So a whole range of things. And we look at art as well.
And part of the question, which I think is, part of the question that I think is really interesting is, how do you see fiction as archival material, if at all?
Right. Yeah. So, I think that fiction is not archival material. I think that that's part of the question we're asking in the class is sort of what's the relationship between these works of fiction that are often taking archival material and sometimes literally using that material and rearranging it. Right. So we read quite a few poems that take as their sort of source material archival texts. And so I would say that they're distinct from archives, but they're doing this kind of work of intervention, right, within those archives. And I think they're doing work to sort of trouble those archives and to complicate what they mean. And I found it really useful to sort of teach the archival text alongside the fictional or the poetic text. So Kiki Petrosino has this beautiful poem that uses a line from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And so we read that excerpt from Jefferson, which is just this like racist stuff that he's saying. And then we read her poem, right, which takes the text and actually creates what's called sort of a golden shovel out of that sentence. And so I think it's a great way to teach some of this archival material that is like kind of bad and traumatic and can feel like it's perpetuating or aggravating, right, these sort of racist ideas. And so, what would it mean if every time we taught Jefferson, we also taught Kiki Petrosino, right? And we also gave these other options that could sort of attend to or supplement or recontextualize the archival sources.
Or jeopardize them. Put them in jeopardy.
Jeopardize their authority.
That's right. Lori, what methods of archival are you currently using or preserving in your personal life, if any?
In my personal life, I was just thinking about the university system because every time I go on to try to do some research, you have to be enrolled somewhere or, in this university to get access to it. And, we also just finished a film production at the Kennedy Center. And, just thinking about that fair use. And, we had to really just, because we wanted to document the whole thing, and we had to really just fight all the way till the end, till a few days out before signing the contract, that we wanted to have the right to use that footage. And one of them was the 1832 wax cylinder that one of the Passamaquoddy culture bearers that was a part of the production, Duane Toma, they were doing a PBS series on him through Native Vision Maker, and I think it's called Native America 2.0. And, just being able to access that just became a huge challenge between, such a large federal bureaucracy, to have to say, okay, we want to access this so Duane can use it, because the film people couldn't come in and film. I just was sitting here thinking about institutions and, community folk, just like back home on the res, who want just to get access into, like you said, your class. When do we just stop doing that? Because so much is on YouTube, so much is available, but we don't have access. I watch YouTube a lot just to listen to Bind Deloria, maybe every 3 months or so, because I'm so inspired, by one of our longtime scholars and activists that, really influenced so much in Indian country, even including the library services. I think it was in 1978 or so, I think it was called The Right to Know, and it was a publication, that they had a gathering in Denver, Colorado, and they prepared it for the White House for library services to, start giving folks through our treaty rights and trust responsibilities, access to our own historical documents, to bring them home. And so much of the tribal colleges now have, again, their own archives. And so we can just go in there and, look at family records, as well as, stuff that is, being sent home by different families and people who have collected them from over the years, white folks too, bringing them back home. So I think that's important, for our children to be able to access that. Like I said, with the photo early on, I would have never saw that photo if it wasn't for, our family getting access to those photos, about the boarding school history. So.
Truly so important. Well, we have one final question that came in earlier. I know there were so many questions that came in before. I'm so sorry to everybody that I did not get to ask all of those questions. I'll tell you in advance. Please don't email me, DM me, or anything. I do what I can do. So one question that came in a few times was, what comes first, the archive or the story? And another sort of version of that question is, do you collect footage first and then write a script to the footage? So what comes first, the archive of the story or the story? And, I'll start with our filmmakers, and then if anybody else wants to add something, more than happy. But let's start with Stanley. What comes first for you?
I think they both come at the same time. One of the things that we try to always do is start looking for archival material at the very beginning. One of the things that really, we do a lot of historical films. One of the things that really can color even what we choose to do is there archival? Is there enough archival to really tell the story? At one point, we were talking to American Experience, the show on PBS, and they wanted to do a film about African-American doctor, who moved into a neighborhood in Chicago and got run out of the neighborhood by, the Klan in Chicago in 1925. But there was one picture of the guy, and so I didn't know a way to tell the story, except hire Denzel Washington to play the doctor or something. So I think that it's important that for us, that we understand, what archival exists, and then, dig deeper and hopefully find more. But I think that it's an ongoing process and both of are kind of happening at the same time. I think one of the things that is really important for filmmakers, that they start looking for the archival at the beginning. So if you're taking 6 months to make a film, you're looking for archival the whole time. If you're taking a year, you're looking for archival the whole time. If you're 10 years to make a film, you're looking for archival the whole time.
And Bing, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's for me. I feel like story comes first. But I was also thinking about, this is a point made earlier by Stanley, like, and this goes back to the, like things are being recorded on cell phones right now so ubiquitously. Um, they're not being recorded necessarily to tell the story. They're being recorded for a number of other reasons, social media, memorabilia. The things that I think we're oftentimes documentary filmmakers are used to accessing to make a film about are archives that are produced by, news agencies and other documentarians who, have just shot verite and, they're allowing access now. And it's making me think now about, um, what it's going to look like for documentary filmmakers now who are telling stories, who have a, treasure trove of unused material that might be useful for the future, that will, then become archival for future filmmakers. Um, but for me, I don't. I think it's there's a few there's one Asif Kapadia. When he did Senna, when I saw Senna, I was blown away. It was the first time I'd seen a film that was completely archival. And I just wonder, how many more of those films are still possible to tell in that way.
Hmm. Does anybody else have anything to add? Eliza?
Well, yeah, I'll just say quickly that, this is different from the film context, but, the text and the artwork that we look at in my class always begin with the archive, because that is sort of the source material that they're thinking about. And one of our sort of main theoretical texts, we read Hartman, we read John Keane, but we also really are sort of thinking with Toni Morrison, with the site of memory. And in that essay, she talks about moving from image to text, right? So what it means to start out with an archive or a photograph or a document and build a story from there, right? Build a poem from a sentence. So that's, I think, a kind of specific thing with my class and with this sort of idea. But I think it's a really interesting thing to think about is the differences and the overlaps, and what emerges when you start with image or start with text and go back and forth. So that's just something I'll add on to that.
Yeah, and just the thought that, like, as a filmmaker, maybe, this idea that you start with a sentence and you build a poem, like every photo, every image is its own sentence, right? And it's our job in some ways to weave those sentences together to make, the most beautiful, the most honest story and most accurate, really, story that we can tell. Thank you all so much for this. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I hope people got as much out of it as I did. So thanks again for joining The Personal is Historical. And thank you again to the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting this series. Thank you to our panelists. If you'd like to know more about them and want some more information on them and their films and their works, their full bios are available at firelightmedia.tv on the events page. And please keep up to date with Firelight Media and the Beyond Resilience series by visiting Firelight Media's website at firelightmedia.tv. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.